Thank you, Bishop Taylor, and thank you, everyone. I'd like to start with a little bit of history on the Margaret Parker Lecture, for those of you who are new to our diocese, which there are many, but also for those whose memories are short. Richard Parker, lecturer in public policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and his brothers, Stephen and David, launched the Margaret Parker Lecture Series in 2008 in memory of their mother, a diocesan lay leader and lifelong advocate for women. The Diocesan Convention Series honors Parker, who died in 2007 at the age of 93. She was an active lay leader and ministry partner with her husband, the Reverend Canon Richard Parker, who served for 42 years as the rector of St. Cross Church in Hermosa Beach. Inspired by her ministry and legacy, this lecture series amplifies and celebrates voices of peace and justice through the empowerment of women. Lecturers have included the Right Reverend Barbara Harris, Dolores Huerta, the Reverend Jim Wallace, among others. We are grateful to Richard and Stephen, who are here today, along with Steve's wife, Kim, and their neighbor from growing up, the kid they played with down the street, Hendrix. And also our gratitude to their brother David, who could not be here. He's off to New York to be a best man in a wedding. So grateful to them for enriching our diocesan conventions with these wonderful lectures. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce our Margaret Parker Lecturer for 2021, a woman who has been called the Queen of Green, and who has been named the single most influential environmental regulator in history, Mary Nichols. Born in Minneapolis and raised in Ithaca, Ms. Nichols comes by her natural gifts of teaching and leading honestly. Her father was a professor at Cornell, and her mother was the head of the foreign language department for Ithaca Public Schools. She received her undergraduate degree from Cornell and her Juris Doctor from Yale Law School. It's wonderful that we have the opportunity to hear Ms. Nichols here in Riverside, because it is in Riverside that she got her start in environmental regulation. In 1972, the city of Riverside, where the highest levels of ozone were recorded, approached Ms. Nichols, then a brand new attorney, about suing the city of Los Angeles over its air pollution. Being the visionary that she is, she instead brought the suit against the United States federal government, arguing that the Clean Air Act under the Environmental Protection Agency, AKA the EPA, must force California to develop a real plan to deal with its pollution. If you are someone like me who has watched our skies become less and less smoggy, you have Mary Nichols to thank for that. Since this critical moment in her early work, Ms. Nichols has gone on to serve as part of the EPA, as chair of the California Air Resources Board, and as a faculty member at UCLA, both in the School of Law and the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. She also served a critical role at the UN's Climate Change Conference, also known as the Conference of the Parties, AKA COP, in both 2015 in Paris and in these past 2 weeks in Glasgow. She is fresh off her flight back to LA from Glasgow yesterday. So as part of the presiding bishop's delegation to COP this year, I tracked the work virtually of Ms. Nichols and many others at this most critical moment in our history in the work of climate justice. Beyond her groundbreaking work as an environmental regulator and her dedication to teaching and supporting young leaders, Ms. Nichols is another one of those amazing Episcopalians Bishop Taylor mentioned. She is a member of and a lay leader of St. James in the city, and for me personally, she has been a source of great support, of education, of inspiration and encouragement for our fledgling Bishops' Commission on Climate Justice. Please join me in welcoming to the microphone the Queen of Green herself, Ms. Mary Nichols.
Thank you so much, Canon McCarthy, for that incredible introduction. It was really wonderful. Good afternoon, friends and fellow Episcopalians. If you've been following the news coverage of the United Nations gathering in Glasgow, Scotland, these past 2 weeks, you may be wondering if anything really happened. You may be feeling discouraged by the apparent lack of meaningful progress in bending the curve of the increasing buildup of gases in the atmosphere. And you may be wondering if anything can be done now to stop the Earth's atmosphere from reaching temperatures no humans have ever experienced by the end of this century. Or, as a rational person and a church leader, because you wouldn't be listening to my remarks here if you were not, you may be saying to yourself, I'd rather be spending my time working on a problem closer to home, like homelessness and injustice. Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about the climate talks in Glasgow and the stories that you don't get from reading or watching the news, and why I think that we who are gathered here are uniquely qualified and called upon to address this very real crisis. First, just some facts. To be clear, atmospheric modelers, geoscientists, statisticians, historians, and all branches of science are in agreement that the buildup of greenhouse gases is already irreversible. Sea level rise is underway. Glaciers have already melted. Whole categories of nature, mostly insects, maybe not very appealing plants, have disappeared. They are now able to attribute specific fires, floods, and hurricanes to greenhouse gases that are literally baked into the Earth's atmosphere. We also know that these changes in the condition of our planet are caused by actions that civilized people, starting with the Industrial Revolution in Northern Europe and quickly spreading to the United States, and now overtaken by China and other parts of Asia, rapidly catching up, were undertaken intentionally. The burning of fossil fuels for heat, light, and mobility was not something that was forced upon our ancestors over the last 200 years, and it was certainly not caused by some freak of nature. Hundreds of millions of people enjoy longer, healthier lives because of changes that were enabled by coal and petroleum. This progress came at a cost of social upheaval, and it was certainly not spread equally. But still, we need to acknowledge that there is no way any of us who are not indigenous to the Riverside area would be here today if it were not for the burning of fossil fuels. Now, the prophets among us have been crying out for several decades that it can't go on like this. And they are right. Either we will write off whole parts of our home planet as uninhabitable, we will find ways to adapt quickly, we will make radical changes in the way we use energy to stop compounding the crisis, or we will do all of these things. And there's really only one choice. We have to do it all, and we have to do it fast, because like that guy with a sign down on the corner of 7th and Olive that says the end of year, the end is near, he's right, probably before the end of this century. Now, if you're like me, you don't really respond very well to the guilt and recriminations that tend to follow from recognizing the mess that we're in. When I was a public official, up to a few short months ago, had responsibility for crafting California's response to the challenge. I had to keep looking for solutions and to convince other people that change is less painful than the alternative. And this is the task that most of the leaders of the nations, including those that were gathered in Glasgow, are failing at. And it's where we, the people, and we as Christians come in. So let me talk a little bit about what Glasgow is actually like. First, let me try to set the scene. This was the 26th Conference of Parties, or COP, parties to the Rio Treaty that first declared climate change to be a global threat and committed the nations of the world, the members of the United Nations, to do something about it. President George H.W. Bush visited that conference and supported the agreement. And the agreement has been updated several times, most significantly in Kyoto and in Paris. And many updates have been made to reflect the fact that while our knowledge of the science and the solutions continues to improve, the situation on the ground continues to get worse. The global pandemic temporarily halted travel and shut down much of industry, and it made a barely perceptible dent in the increasing rise in emissions of greenhouse gases. So this year, with a new president determined to act on global warming and an administration filled with highly competent experts like John Kerry and Gina McCarthy, and polls showing large majorities of Americans supporting radical ideas like shutting down coal-fired power plants, many people thought that this would be the year for a big, bold agreement. Instead, at the official end of the meeting on Friday, negotiators were still struggling with language about how countries would report their emissions and how nations could cooperate to jointly achieve results through trade agreements or so-called market mechanism. There were some major pledges along the way, some of them that had been made before, some reiterated or strengthened, including a halt to new coal plants and a focus on methane emissions from agriculture, landfills, and oil and gas operations. But mostly the agreements are written in very carefully opaque diplomatic language, or to quote the activist Greta Thunberg, blah, blah, blah. Now, what went wrong? Well, not much if you realize that the haggling over text was going on in a small room with professional negotiators who were there to represent their national governments, far away from the thousands of people in pavilions and auditoriums and online, like Melissa McCarthy, watching the proceedings, talking to each other, and some marching in the streets. The only parties to the Paris Agreement are national governments, the 293 member states of the United Nations. Even states like California or cities like Los Angeles that have adopted climate plans and have achieved real emissions reductions have no official standing at this event. We do not get to speak to the negotiators unless we happen to chance upon them, in the street or a restaurant somewhere. So why did I go? Why endure the long lines that you have to stand in to get your credentials, the daily COVID test results that have to be submitted, not to mention the expense of getting there and the terrible food that's available inside the convention halls? Well, first of all, it's a way to reinforce the message, now accepted by our national government leaders, that climate action actually happens at the state and local level. As Governor Jay Inslee from Washington told a room full of international officials who are part of something called the Under 2 Coalition, a group of states that have committed themselves to doing everything that they can do to keep our temperature from rising above 2 degrees centigrade. We, the states, can do more to achieve the goal of net zero emissions because we can move faster, farther, and with more flexibility than national governments. So attending this mass event is also an opportunity to showcase for California and to learn about innovative policy ideas. And the presence of business leaders, financiers, and advocacy groups, including the growing youth movement that was there, penetrates even inside of the walled-off negotiation rooms, causing the diplomats and the press corps to send urgent messages home to their bosses. Help, we have to change. As a Californian, there to be part of a delegation representing the most populous state in the United States, the one with the longest coastline and some of the most endangered natural resources, it's been my mission for more than a decade to spread the word about California's ambitious programs and the specific details about how they work, with the goal of inspiring others to follow our lead in their own jurisdictions. And it's worked. California's zero emissions mandate for new cars and trucks did more to inspire the growing demand for advanced technology vehicles and the broad response by manufacturers than any other single factor, and they will acknowledge that themselves. Other elements of our portfolio of climate policies, including a target of 100% renewable electricity and a low-carbon fuel standard that uses a fee on gasoline and conventional diesel fuels to provide incentives for renewable biodiesel and other ultra-low emission fuels. Los Angeles has the first ever petroleum refinery that has been converted to making 100% renewable aviation fuel, and 2 more conversions are in the works. That's worth applause. Thank you. So I hope you can agree with me that California actually has quite a lot to talk about and to be proud of. But we also learned from what others are doing. For example, we heard about IKEA's campaign to have all of its deliveries worldwide be in zero-emission trucks by 2025. And we heard the governor of New Mexico talk about her plans to wean her state from their role as one of the #1 oil and gas producers in the country by 2045. All this and more of the solutions on display could, if scaled up, actually add up to meeting the Paris Pledge. In other words, we heard and we saw and we talked about the fact it can be done. And with the growth in emissions, it must begin. But the problem is that we in California are only about 0.1% of the ongoing emissions. The growth is in Africa, Asia, Latin America, places where demand for energy to create development opportunities to support a better life for their populations is growing, not shrinking, not aging. Here in the US, the risk of wildfires and the benefits of electric cars and solar roofs are also not spread evenly. And so even though we have done much to try to use the resources that we've gained as a result of fees on higher emitting fuels to the benefit of inner city communities, we are far from achieving true environmental justice. And the estimates of $3 trillion that would be needed to convert the entire world to sustainable energy caused many political leaders to simply throw up their hands and say, there's no way we're going to meet this goal, and since we're going to fail anyway, why should we even get started? So I saw a lot of very anxious and distressed faces inside the Glasgow Convention Center, and a lot of angry people, many of them young, shouting and waving signs out in the street. And a couple of times after panels that I was speaking on, I was confronted by people who wanted to know how I could be so positive and optimistic in the face of the obvious failure to make the kinds of radical changes to all of our systems that will be needed. Really, nothing in the agreement coming out of Glasgow sounds like radical change. And my only answer that I could give was, you're right. Keep on pushing. In the midst of all of this dissonance, however, that I was experiencing, I had one really remarkable encounter. I happened to have a lunch date with Catherine Hayhoe, a Canadian climate scientist who was recently appointed as the chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy, or TNC, is an old-line, mainstream, not-for-profit organization known for its work on saving species and habitats using state-of-the-art information and financial tools to preserve land and water resources, not known as a climate activist organization. Catherine has won awards for her work as an evangelical Christian who is able to communicate effectively about climate change to people who do not like or trust scientists at all. And her being taken up by the Nature Conservancy and taking on this role is, I think, a pretty powerful sign of how conservation in the old-fashioned sense of the term and conservatism and also science can be melded together. Our meeting was scheduled by our respective organizational sponsors to talk about some possible collaboration on projects to restore the natural carbon capturing capacity of some very badly degraded agricultural lands in China, where TNC has worked and where California also has a strong relationship. But after a certain amount of exploratory chat and talk about how to raise the funds to do this project, she gave me a copy of her new book called Saving Us: A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Fractured World. Now, the title is self-explanatory, but the underlying theme is much more interesting, I think. Her argument, in pretty simple terms, told by a good storyteller, is that we in our own communities are giving up, that we have become so paralyzed or so depressed or so guilty about the fact that we haven't been able to figure out how to stop global warming that we just are unable to move forward. Many people, she reports, knowing that she's a religious person, come up to her and in effect sort of offer to confess. I don't drive an electric car. I took an airplane to get here. And they somehow feel that if they could just tweak their consumption habits, be better consumers, that they could save the world. Well, it's just not so. Catherine, I think, is right in saying that we need to look at the facts, knowing that a transition away from the effects of fossil fuels is necessary, and find the tools that can make that transition happen as fast and with as little harm to individuals as possible. For example, to cite how you might go about thinking about something like this, and it's a wonky example, but bear with me here. California put in place a system whereby electric utilities have to buy carbon allowances to cover the emissions that they create from their gas burning or, in some cases, imported coal facilities. And then they have to donate the value of those allowances to their customers. This is a way of sending a message to twice, really. Once to the companies that have a choice about whether to pay for those allowances or invest in cleaner sources of electricity that would benefit everybody. And the benefit of the purchase of the cleaner electricity goes to the customers, probably unbeknownst to them in most cases, because although it's spelled out on your electricity bill, unless you're the kind of person who reads the fine print on your utility bill, which I certainly don't, you wouldn't even be aware of the fact that you were getting this credit. But the point is that the state found a way to put the burden of complying with our drive to get to renewable electricity on the entities who are most capable of making the decision and choosing to do it themselves, and to spare the customers the cost of making that switch. Now, there's a lot of ways that this could be done. There are many policy tools that people have experimented with and are using now. But the point is, these are the kinds of things that are going to have to be done to make really deep, meaningful changes happen. So what's our responsibility then, those of us who are here? Well, I would argue that what we need to do as consumers, as family members, as people of faith, is to act and vote and talk out of hope that we need to do what we do all the time and what our bishops and ministers talk to us about, which is to engage with each other and spread good deeds and show love for creation and for each other, and to keep on trying. The persistence of poverty and racism, of unequal justice, requires us to keep on working, and solving for the disaster of climate change needs to be done as a part of and in conjunction with our ethical duty to address those issues as well. So it's first and foremost a matter of not being afraid to think big and bigger than we've been thinking before about the kinds of changes that need to happen to support the people in our midst who are talking about systemic change, not just about nibbling around the edges, because that is what this is going to require. Now, we can do a lot in our own communities to break the grip of fossil fuels and move in the direction of more sustainable energy. We need to find ways to integrate it into our own agendas, whether we're responsible for managing properties or for investing funds. We can all learn more about the opportunities to green our surroundings, make them more sustainable by planting trees that can reduce the need for air conditioning and conserve imported water, reduce food waste, and get away from single-use plastics in our schools, in our homes, etc., and on Sunday mornings. But we also have to insist that governments at every level stop subsidizing the oil and gas industry and make them clean up their ways. So I think we're going to find allies all around us once we start to show that we understand what the real game is here. We can find others to work with on these issues and other institutions that share these goals. All of these activities in turn, as they garner some success, will give us all a feeling of more confidence and an ability to support each other. Most of all, I think we need to keep talking with each other about our concerns and learning about the specifics of what could be done, because I think if we can find the energy and the courage in ourselves to begin these conversations, I think we will find new ways to succeed in this monumental but absolutely essential task of stewardship. And so Bishop Taylor and Canon McCarthy, I'm excited about your plans for the commission for the future, and I am looking forward to taking the next steps with you. Thank you.